Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Adamson from the Office of Public Works. I'm dealing with flood risk management, and I'd like to thank the organisers very much for inviting me to come along today to speak to you about flood risk management, what we're doing in the OPW. So to commence, I'd like to just start with a little bit of a high-level overview, background and context. Back in the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, there was a fair bit of local land drainage that went on, which were then formed into what are called the drainage districts. And in the middle of the last century, then the Arterial Drainage Act came into force that empowered the OPW to do some large-scale arterial drainage. And I'll speak about that in the next slides. Then in 1995, as urban flooding started to become more of a significant issue, the Act was amended and the OPW commenced its programme of flood relief schemes for urban protection. And again, I'll talk about that in a few slides. And then almost a decade after that, there was a more substantial root and branch review of how we address flood risk in Ireland. And that set a new policy, which included a greater emphasis on prevention and preparedness, as well as just protection. The review also set us out on a programme of trying to take a more proactive approach to assessing and managing flood risk, and that gave rise then to the National CFRAM programme, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, kicking off with the pilots in 2005, culminating in 2018 with the publication of the National Flood Risk Management Plans. And the CFRAM programme was very much in line with the EU Floods Directive that came into force shortly afterwards in 2007. And again, I'll speak about those slightly later in the presentation. So just speaking first a little bit about the arterial drainage schemes. As I said, the number of schemes were done primarily in the 50s, 60s and 70s to improve agricultural land for agricultural purposes. And I think it's important to flag that the extent of the schemes covers about 11,500 kilometres of rivers, and our activities are focused on those designated scheme channels. There are quite often reports of other drainage works or works in channels which are ongoing elsewhere, which may be undertaken, for example, by local landowners or farmers, but are often associated with OPW. That's often not the case. Our work is focused on those designated scheme channels. I think it's also important to flag the benefits of the arterial drainage schemes. They do provide improvement for agricultural purposes to almost 250,000 hectares of agricultural land in Ireland, which economically is obviously very important, as well as providing secondary benefits in terms of slightly reducing flood risk to over 20,000 properties. Well, as I said, there have been no new arterial drainage works now for some decades, but we do have a statutory duty to maintain those schemes that were previously built. This involves an annual programme of around 2,000 kilometres of channel and 150 kilometres of embankment, which are maintained each year, which are subject to appropriate assessment, environmental assessments as necessary. A number of years ago, there were environmental guidance procedures prepared to try and make sure that the work that's done on the maintenance reduces as far as reasonably possible its impact on the environment. They were recently updated again as part of a continuous improvement on the procedures, and also a programme of training and audits have been put in place to try and ensure that the high standards are indeed maintained. Now, the work, when originally done, as I said a few decades ago, clearly would have involved a significant modification of the channels back in the day. So in line with the current CIS guidance on designation of heavily modified water bodies, the scheme channels, as well as other channels and other water bodies around the country, are currently being reviewed by the EPA in terms of their potential designation. And a number of arterially drained channels, but by no means all of them, are provisionally designated as heavily modified water bodies. And in the context, again, of the hydromorphology, I think it's important to note that the hydromorphology programme, as set out in the draft river basin management plans, will clearly interact quite significantly with the arterial drainage maintenance programme. The controlled activities for the protection of waters regime, which is due to come in, clearly will have an interaction. And this may involve, for example, bringing the environmental guidance procedures that we currently operate up to a certain standard and to set them on a statutory or binding basis. And equally, with regards to the river restoration programme, the work that we're currently doing under arterial drainage maintenance can help contribute to this by building on the work that we have been doing for a number of years in collaboration with the IFI to provide environmental enhancements to the drain channels. I move on now to the EU Floods Directive. I'm sure some of this people will be aware of already. The first step of the directive is to undertake what's called a preliminary flood risk assessment. This is essentially a screening assessment to identify the hotspots, the areas of potentially significant flood risk around the country. In Ireland, this was completed in 2011, and we identified 300 such hotspots. And it's worth noting that they are home to approximately 2/3 of the population. So the CFRAM programme, which followed, was quite significantly comprehensive in terms of addressing flood risk around the country. So the CFRAM programme then kicked in. After following on from the pilots, the national programme commenced in 2011, involved the preparation of the flood maps, and culminated in 2018 with the publication of the flood risk management plans. We have already started work on the next cycle. So we've already commenced work in terms of our national flood risk assessment as part of the PFRA, so that's underway. We have an ongoing programme to review the flood maps and the flood risk management plans that are due in the next cycle. We would look to see as being a significant evolution on where we are today, particularly in terms of reflecting the demand for multi-sectoral benefits and enhanced coordination, clearly with the River Basin Management Plan in mind, but also other areas such as the cross-sectoral coordination with regards to climate change. So now to speak about the Capital Flood Relief Programme. As I mentioned, this arises on foot of the amendment of 1995, but the FRMPs that were published in 2018 made proposals for 120 additional flood relief schemes required around the country, which in combination with schemes that have been previously constructed or already in hand, mean that we have about 200 schemes in total, which either have been built, are being built, are in various stages of planning and design, or that will be delivered in the coming years. And this is underpinned by an investment in the National Development Plan of around 1.3 billion out to 2030. But the way these schemes are being delivered is evolving. There is a clear trend towards a greater focus on nature-based solutions, multiple benefits, and obviously taking into account the potential impacts of climate change on the adaptation to that change. So I'll just speak now in the coming slides on those particular issues. So first, nature-based solutions. This is an emerging approach which is often promoted. It has at times been flagged as something of a silver bullet to solve all problems, which unfortunately is not the case. There are issues around them and limitations in terms of where they're applicable. The benefits of them are somewhat more difficult to quantify relative to more traditional flood relief schemes. While the benefits have been shown and clearly demonstrated through a range of pilot projects for small events, so the kind of floods we might see every year, every couple of years, for example, their effectiveness in major events, so more extreme events we might see, for example, only once every 100 years, which is what we would typically deal with in the OPW, their effectiveness in such events is almost certainly going to be reduced. There are also practicality issues in terms of large catchments, because these are often very small interventions that involve significant landowner engagement and ownership. So trying to promote these from a top-down perspective is clearly going to be sort of problematic in terms of the stakeholder engagement and landowner engagement resources that would be required. Having said all that, there is clearly benefits to other sectors and a place for nature-based solutions in the way we approach flood risk management. So in the FRMPs that were published then in 2018, there are specific actions to promote nature-based solutions at the national level, but then also at the scheme-specific level, at the project scale. There's a requirement that the scope or the potential for nature-based solutions to form part of the answer, part of the scheme, is now required. So on foot of that, the OPW is co-funding with the EPA the substantial Slow Waters project, and the OPW has also provided funding both for the design and then the construction of the nature-based solution work that's now being implemented up in the Inishowen Peninsula in Donegal. These options are also being now fully considered in the context of flood relief schemes. There have in fact been some upstream storage solutions previously provided through the flood relief schemes in locations such as Clonakilty and the Wad in Dublin, and they are part of the design for the PODL scheme. As I mentioned earlier, it's a requirement now for the design and development of all future schemes that they specifically assess the potential for nature-based solutions to form part of the scheme going forward. The nature-based solutions also have a potential place in terms of adaptation to climate change, and I'll come to that later on. I think it's important to recognise that nature-based solutions are not simply flood risk management measures that happen to have other benefits. They are essentially catchment management measures that will provide a range of benefits. So the OPW is co-chairing with the EPA the working group under the WFD governance structures to promote the awareness and take-up of nature-based solutions. And we are actively engaging with the department and other bodies in terms of how we can try and promote and facilitate the implementation of nature-based solutions from a grassroots bottom-up way, rather than trying to impose them from a top-down perspective. To talk about multiple benefits then, clearly the primary objective of a flood relief scheme is to reduce flood risk. However, such capital investment in urban areas can clearly also bring with it multiple benefits, such as in the areas of public realm, amenity, biodiversity, and potentially climate mitigation. So we have been working for some time to try and encapsulate and embed those wider range of objectives into the development of our flood risk management programs. This was initiated almost 15 years ago by the development of what's called the multi-criteria analysis that was part of the CFRAM program. So this involves assessing potential options for schemes against environmental, social and cultural heritage objectives, as well as the purely economics. And that MCA, that multi-criteria analysis, is now also embedded and taken forward at a project level for the development of individual schemes. Last year, there was a full review of the way we do the economic appraisal of our flood relief schemes. That was completed last year, and it includes recommendations for bringing those other benefits forward into the economic appraisal, as well as that broader MCA process. And the current brief for our flood relief schemes, for the development of our flood relief schemes, is further encouraging greater stakeholder engagement, and specifically requires stakeholder workshops to identify at an early stage in the project, so they could be considered at the start of the design process rather than at the end, what potential there might be to capture multiple benefits as part of the scheme. And of course, we're continuing with our cross-sectoral engagement at a national level with the relevant authorities responsible for the WFD, and increasingly so also then with the cross-sectoral collaboration for climate adaptation. So to close out then with some discussions around climate adaptation, the OPW produced in 2019, along with all of the other sectors, the Sectoral Adaptation Plan for ourselves in relation to flood risk management, building on the assessments of the potential impacts of climate change that would have been undertaken through the CFRAM program and other projects. And this is built around three objectives: to build our understanding of the potential impacts of climate change, embedding or mainstreaming adaptation in how we undertake flood risk management, then also ensuring that adaptation is part of the whole of government approach to managing flood risk. And so these three objectives are then underpinned by 21 actions, including actions for ongoing research and assessment of the potential future risks, adaptation for flood relief schemes that I'll talk a bit more about in the next slide, and then very importantly, the consideration of climate change in land use planning and development management, to make sure that we take into account areas that are potentially prone to flooding in the future, as well as at present, when we're zoning lands for development or we're making development management decisions. Just to expand a little bit then on the flood relief scheme climate change adaptation plans. So these will be adaptation plans specific to each scheme, with the purpose of planning now for that potential future flood risk, applying a adaptive management approach. So we have a flexible pathway to support future decision making, but recognizing that there's no one size fits all. There isn't one silver bullet that can solve all adaptation problems. So the adaptive approach is built around what we call the 4As framework, where the various decision points can involve either assumptive decisions, so assuming that a certain amount of change will take place and building for that now. An adaptive approach, so that we build now to allow for whatever is built to be adapted easily in the future. To identify potential alternative solutions on top of what is currently built now. So this, again, is where the nature-based solutions may well play a strong role. Or indeed acceptance. So accepting that flood risk will become greater in the future, and managing that through non-structural measures such as our preparedness, our flood forecasting, emergency response, and so on. So just to close then with a couple of words around climate mitigation. I think it's worth noting here that flood events themselves will have a carbon footprint. When a property is damaged by a flood event, there is a carbon cost to that in terms of the repairs that are required to the building fabric, the replacement of goods, be they carpets, sofas, whiteware, etc., and indeed the dehumidification process, which is extremely energy intensive. So a flood relief scheme in itself will clearly reduce the flood damages and by extension, therefore, reduce future emissions. And there is some early UK research which indicates that the carbon benefits in terms of reducing emissions by preventing flood events and flood damages actually outweighs the carbon footprint of building the scheme in the first place. However, notwithstanding that, we are clearly looking at the way flood relief schemes are built. Again, a requirement for all schemes going forward is that the carbon footprint of the proposed schemes are calculated and will need to be minimised. And as part of the review of project appraisal that I referred to earlier, the carbon footprint will need to be embedded as well into the economic appraisal. So that's a very quick overview of what we're doing in flood risk management at the moment, hopefully relevant to the context of the Water Framework Directive. So thank you very much for your attention, and I think we'll take questions at the end of this session. Thank you.